Hello, and welcome to the online information session for the Public Scholars Program of the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Mark Silver. I'm a program officer in the NEH Division of Research Programs. Also on the call is Program Officer Beauty Bragg, who is substituting today for Gwen Yates, the program analyst for the Public Scholars Program. This session is scheduled to last for about 1 hour, from 2 o'clock until 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And I'm planning to make a presentation that should last about 30 minutes, and I'll take questions from you for the remainder of the hour. On the next slide, I have an overview of the topics that I'm planning to cover. I'll start off talking about the goals of the program and its scope. I'll explain the eligibility requirements and go over some key details of the program, including the time commitment that we expect from grant recipients. We'll look at the review criteria, the application materials that we ask you to submit, and then also the mechanics of submitting your application. And I'll take time at the end for your questions. You should, by the way, feel free to type questions in at any time during the presentation using the Q&A box. And my colleague, Beauty Bragg, will answer some of those in the box as they're coming in, and she'll defer some of them for me to handle at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question, you're welcome to send us an email asking us that question. Our email address is publicscholars@neh.gov, and I'll put that address up on the final slide as well. My hope is that this session will help you decide if the Public Scholars Program is right for you. And if you decide that it is right for you, that you'll understand what it takes to submit a strong application to the program. We will, by the way, be posting a recording of this session. So if you want to refer to that recording later as you're preparing your application, it will be available on the NEH website. You should give us a week or so to post it, but we do plan to post it, and it will be available up until and through the deadline for applying. All right, let's get started then. First, I want to talk about the goals of the program. The overarching goal is to support the creation of well-researched nonfiction books in the humanities written for the broad public. Related to that goal, we want to encourage writers outside the academic world to deepen their engagement with the humanities by strengthening the research underlying their books. We know that deep research takes time, it takes effort, and we know it's not always possible to put as much research into a book as you might like to, so we want to help solve that problem. We also want to encourage academic writers in the humanities to communicate the significance of their research to the broadest possible range of readers. Just as it takes time and effort to do good research, it also takes time and effort to write for a general audience and do that effectively. If you're a professional scholar, it's in some ways easier to write for other scholars. That's probably what you were trained to do. So writing for a general audience requires some adjustment as you find a new voice, perhaps. So we hope that this program will help encourage you to make that adjustment. The scope of the program. We welcome applications in all areas of the humanities, regardless of geographic or chronological focus. If you look at the list of awards that we've made in this program so far, and so far we've made over 180 awards, that list is dominated by projects that have an American focus, but we don't have a preference for projects with an American focus. We welcome proposals having to do with any geographic area or historical period. The books must be written in an accessible style. They must frame their topics to have wide appeal. This is absolutely crucial in this program. If you're not interested in devoting energy to writing in that way, then this is not the right program for you. And as the slide says, books written primarily for an audience of professional scholars are not suitable. So that's just to reiterate the point. This slide shows some recent and forthcoming books that have been sponsored by the program. Nearly 70 books have either been published or announced for release with the sponsorship of the Public Scholars Program, but here are three examples. On the left is a book by the independent writer Kevin Birmingham called The Sinner and the Saint, Dostoevsky and the Gentleman Murderer Who Inspired a Masterpiece. That's due out from Penguin in November. In the middle is All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake. This book is by Tia Miles, who was a professor at the University of Michigan when she applied. And that book was published by Random House in June of this year. On the right is art historian Betty Talvacchia's book, The Two Michelangelos, and that's due to be published by Lund Humphreys in November. Before I go any further, I want to just pause for a moment and talk about what we mean by the humanities. The founding legislation for the National Endowment for the Humanities lists a number of disciplines that are meant to be encompassed by that term, humanities. The legislation also makes clear that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but it does mention these disciplines: history, literature and language, history and theory of the arts, philosophy and ethics, archaeology, comparative religion, jurisprudence, and those social sciences employing humanistic methods. If you're uncertain about whether your project would fall within the humanities, we're happy to discuss that question with you and give you some guidance. So feel free to get in touch with us if you have questions about that. Next, the eligibility requirements for the program. The program's open to all US citizens. It doesn't matter where you are in the world when you apply. And the program is also open to foreign nationals who've been living in the US for the 3 years preceding the December 15th, 2021 application deadline. Currently enrolled students are not eligible to apply. Then also on this point of eligibility, we have a requirement for previous publication. And you can meet this requirement in one of two ways. Either with a nonfiction book published with a commercial or a university press, and that book could have been an academic book, that's all right. Or option B here is to meet that previous publication requirement with 3 articles or essays in general interest publications that reach a large audience. No advanced degree is required to apply, and no institutional affiliation is required either. In fact, on that last point, we have a special encouragement in place for independent writers. The program encourages applications from writers who are not currently affiliated with a college or a university, Maybe you're a full-time biographer, or you're a journalist, or a magazine writer, or an editor. Or maybe for that matter, you have a day job unrelated to writing, and you do your writing at night. If you have a suitable project for this program, we want you to know about the support that we have available. We also know that there are people who have only a short-term affiliation with a college or university, or who for various reasons might have one foot in the academic world and one foot outside of it. And we want you also to be aware of the program and the opportunities that it provides. None of this, by the way, is meant to suggest that we don't want to hear from full-time university or college professors. Full-time professional academics are entirely welcome to apply to the program, and we absolutely do want to see those applications. It's just that the application pool tends to be dominated by professional scholars already, and we want to broaden our reach to other kinds of applicants as well. Because we know you're out there. Next slide. This is a list, partial list of types of projects that are not supported by the program. To see the full list, you should check section D6 of the funding notice. And you definitely need to be aware of the types of projects that we don't support, lest you spend time preparing an application that's going to be a non-starter. We do not support fiction, including historical or philosophical fiction. So we don't support creative nonfiction. That would mean a book in which you're inventing scenes or dialogue. We don't support autobiography or memoir in this program, or books for children or young adults, or works of graphic fiction or nonfiction. And we don't support dissertation revisions either. And as I said, the full list of not supported projects, of project types that we don't support, is in section D6 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the program. Here are a number of key details regarding the awards. We are buying your time with these awards, so we're quite strict about these rules here. The minimum duration for an award is 6 months of full-time work or the equivalent. So you could, for example, work half-time for 12 months on your project, and that would meet the requirement, since that's the equivalent of 6 full-time months. The maximum duration is 12 months, and that's true even if you're working part-time on the project, so you can't run your calendar longer than 12 months under any circumstances. You cannot work less than half-time at any point during the award period, and you must hold the award continuously as well. How much money are we offering? The stipend is $5,000 per full-time month. So the maximum award is $60,000, which would be for 12 full-time months. We reduce that dollar amount accordingly in the event that you're working part-time, or if you're working less than 12 full months on the project. The application deadline is December 15th, 2021, and you'll hear an answer from us in early August of 2022. So you can see it takes us almost 9 months to review your application and give you an answer, and you need to account for that in your planning. If you were to be notified that you've won an award in August of 2022, the earliest possible start date would be September 1st. In other words, almost right away, you could start holding the award. The latest possible start date would be 1 year after that. which would be September 1st of 2023. And you could start on the 1st of the month at any time in between those two Septembers. So again, as you're planning your project and your schedule, you need to be aware of the timeline that I've laid out here and take that into account. Next, typical activities and products in this program. We support research in primary and secondary sources. That could include interviews, it could include field work of some kind. We support travel to archives and other research sites, and then also writing and revision of your manuscript. And we see proposals that are proposing different balances among those kinds of activities. Some people are at an early stage and they're spending their time on research. Some are at a later stage and they may be spending all of the grant period on writing. And either of those and anything in between is fine as far as we're concerned. The typical products in this program are print books, and they're generally published with a trade press or a university press that has very strong distribution, because we want books sponsored by this program to reach the widest possible audience. You're permitted to propose online materials that are intended to supplement a print book, but the primary product, even in that case, would still have to be a print book. We also see people producing ebooks and or audiobooks as part of their projects as well. Next, I want to talk about the review criteria in the program. And they're on this slide I have up now. Every application is reviewed by a panel of external peer reviewers. And these are the criteria that we instruct them to use as they're evaluating your application. So as an applicant, you absolutely must keep these criteria in mind as you're preparing your application. And you should try to write the application to answer these criteria. These review criteria are published in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So let's take a moment to look more closely at them. The first one is the appeal and intellectual significance of the proposed book for general readers. This is the number one criterion for a reason. It's in many ways the most important one, and both aspects of it, both the appeal and the intellectual significance, are important. So you should frame your topic in a way to make it engaging, to make it interesting. The writing should carry the reader along without undue effort, but the book should also have substance to it. Criterion number two, the applicant's record of research and experience in interpreting the humanities for general audiences. As an applicant, you want to think about how to highlight your record in these areas, both on your resume and also in the application narrative that you submit. The third criterion is the quality of the conception, definition, organization, and description of the project, and the breadth and depth of the humanities research underlying the project. Your project should be well-defined, well-organized. The book should be based on rigorous research, and your application should show that you're aware of the relevant sources and of related books in your area. The fourth criterion is the quality of the writing sample and the applicant's clarity of expression. The writing sample is extremely important in this program because that's where you're demonstrating for the evaluators that you really can write for a popular audience. It's best to submit a draft chapter from your proposed book as the writing sample, if you can. But if that's not possible, make sure that your selection really showcases your skill in writing for a general reader. As I said, that's the most important thing that the evaluators will be looking for in the writing sample. The fifth criterion is the feasibility and appropriateness of the proposed plan of work, the soundness and probable reach of the dissemination plan, and the likelihood that the applicant will complete the project. And that need not necessarily happen during the grant period, by the way. In the plan of work, you need to present a clear schedule of tasks. You should indicate the amount of time that you're going to devote to each of those tasks. We don't, by the way, ask you to take the COVID-19 pandemic into account in your work plan. If you win an award, but your proposed plan is somehow disrupted by the pandemic, it's possible to negotiate adjustments with us later. Your application should also address this question of dissemination. How are you going to publish the book? How will you make sure that it gets noticed once it has been published? You want to think about the press that you're going to publish the book with. And in general, the bigger the print run that the press is able to promise, the stronger their publicity and distribution operation, the better off you're going to be. It will help your application to have a publication contract at the time you apply, but that is not required. That's one of the most frequent questions that we get is, can I apply without a contract? Or what are my chances if I don't have a book contract already? You certainly can apply, and about half the projects that we've funded so far did not have a contract at the time of application. Most of those people did have, though, either a strong previous record of writing a book or books for general readers, or a letter of interest from a publisher. Next slide. The application materials. What do we ask you to submit to us in your application package? First of all, let me say that there are page limits in this list, and you must adhere to those page limits. We're sticklers about this. You're risking disqualification if you don't follow these instructions about the page limit for each part of the application. All right, so what do you need to submit to us? First of all, a 3-page narrative statement explaining your project. And you should follow the format that we explain in the notice of funding opportunity, which is available on the same web page where you clicked the link to join this session today. So 3-page narrative statement, then a 1-page plan of work, a 1-page bibliography, a 1,000-character project summary, a 2-page resume or CV, a 20-page double-spaced writing sample, and a publisher's letter if that's applicable. That is, if you do have interest from a publisher or a contract already, then you may submit a letter to that effect as part of your application. That letter should, if possible, include mention of the likely print run for the project. That would be if you are under contract and you've gotten to that discussion with your publisher already. We recommend that you mention the likely size of the print run in the letter as well, since that will help evaluators gauge the breadth of dissemination that you're planning. You should arrange for 2 letters of reference as well. Those aren't actually due with the application itself. They're due January 24th, 2022, which is several weeks after the application deadline. When you ask for those letters, you should coach your letter writers to study the evaluation criteria for the program and to address those criteria in their letters. You should also coach your letter writers to specifically address your proposed project rather than simply talking about previous work that you may have done and then ending with a line to say, and I'm sure the proposed book will be just as good as those previous pieces that the person has published. It's really much more effective to have a letter writer address the specifics of the project that you're proposing in your application. And then last, additional online forms. There's some other forms as part included in the application package, asking you to identify who your letter writers are and to list the locations where you'll be working during the grant period, and then to provide some personal information as well. The last note on this page says no budget is required. And that's because, as I explained before, the dollar amount of the award is based on the number of months that you commit to as your grant period. Resources for applicants. We have a number of resources that you should be aware of. The single most important one is that notice of funding opportunity, which I've mentioned several times now. And that's available, as I said, on the web page where you clicked the link to join this session today. That notice of funding opportunity is about a 20-page document. It contains all the instructions for assembling and formatting your materials and submitting them to us. So if you're not familiar with that document yet, and you think you may be interested in applying to the program, that would definitely be your next step. Read through the notice of funding opportunity. We also have available on the program website sample application narratives. There are 9 examples there of successful applications that you can study. There's also a list of recently funded projects and another document there with frequently asked questions, or FAQs, that you can refer to as well. All of these things are available at the link that I have on the slide here. Then the last item on this list, and not to be neglected, is advice from the NEH staff. This is the email address and the phone number that you can use to reach the program. We can usually get back to you more quickly by email, but we are available by phone as well. We're not able to comment on draft publications in this program, but we can respond to specific questions that you have about your application or about the review process. A word now about the mechanics of submitting your application, and I have a slide on this as well. As the first step, you need to register at the website grants.gov, which is the portal that you will use to submit your application. Once you've registered, you have to create an individual applicant profile in your account. And that's what's listed here second in the steps on the left-hand side of the slide. Failing to create an individual applicant profile is probably the most common mistake that people seem to make when they're trying to submit their applications to us. If you haven't set up an individual applicant profile, the red button there that says apply will be grayed out and you won't be able to click on it. The program's only open to individual applicants, and if you haven't set up an individual applicant profile on grants.gov, their system won't realize that you're eligible to submit an application to the Public Scholars Program. So that's why the button will be grayed out. And again, the solution is to create an individual applicant profile. And there are more instructions for exactly how to do that in the notice of funding opportunity. Third point here, submit several days early. You want to allow time for some technical problem to come up with your submission, or some other kind of hurdle in understanding the instructions for putting your application through at grants.gov. Especially if you're doing this for the first time, it can be a little bit cumbersome, so do allow extra time to submit the application. Then the last point here is that grants.gov runs a help desk, and it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The phone number is 1-800-518-4726, or you can send them an email at support@grants.gov. And the people at the grants.gov help desk will be able to help you with technical problems much better than we on the NEH staff can. So I encourage you to call the help desk at grants.gov if you're having a problem using grants.gov or submitting your application. All right, so that's the presentation that I've prepared. Here again is our contact information on this slide. And I think some of you have been submitting questions along the way, or if you have a question that you'd like to submit now, please go ahead and do so. And we'll do our best to answer. So let me ask my colleague Beauty Bragg to let me know what has come in.
Okay, great, Mark. Happy to do that. Let's start with a question from Margaret that captures several people's questions. Can you talk more about the publication record? What is a general interest publication, and what is a large audience?
Yeah, the first thing I should say about this probably is that if you feel like you may be a sort of borderline case in meeting this requirement, you can send us a list of your publications and we'll give you a verdict on whether you meet that requirement or not. A large audience generally means a large regional or a national audience. Publications that would meet that requirement would include major newspapers, widely read magazines in the popular press, of the sort that are, say, available at most airports or newsstands. Oh, and the other thing to mention is that online publications do count. So if you've published something on a website that has a large readership and a large following, but there's no equivalent print version, that's okay. And you could use 3 such pieces to meet the requirement. Even relatively short pieces are okay. So an op-ed, for example, or a book review published in a major newspaper or widely read magazine would meet that requirement. If you don't meet the requirement for previous publications, you might look at our fellowships program or the summer stipends program that we offer at NEH. Neither of those programs imposes a requirement for previous publications. They don't have the same emphasis on reaching general readers that the Public Scholars Program has, but they are there for you to consider as other options. Then the other thing that you might consider doing if you don't meet the requirement yet is to think about building up a portfolio maybe over the coming year and then applying to the program a little over a year from now. We do anticipate continuing to offer this program annually, and some people I talk to decide to take that route to work over time on building their eligibility to apply to the program.
Great. thanks. And maybe, Mark, you wanted to address, I think, another angle of that question has been, where do academic journals fit into this publication requirement?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is that you cannot count articles published in peer-reviewed academic journals towards that requirement. So we don't consider such journals to be widely read general interest publications.
Okay, great. Another question, another participant asks, are interviews permitted in the book?
Yes, you're welcome to use interviews as part of your information gathering and as sources, and you could also include some part of an interview or interviews, or maybe if it's a relatively short interview, the whole interview in the book. However, the book should not primarily consist of transcribed interviews or one long transcribed interview. That's one of the types of project that is prohibited in section D6 of the notice, which I mentioned, where we list prohibited project types. So a book that consists solely of interviews or of an interview would not be allowed, but you could certainly excerpt an interview or include an interview as some part of the book.
Great, thanks. Another question is, what counts as full-time and part-time work? Is this calculated in terms of hours per week, for example?
Yes, generally full-time to us means 40 hours per week that you're devoting to the project. If you have a teaching position, we would not allow you to continue teaching while holding the award full-time. So even if you are thinking to yourself, well, I'm actually only teaching 3 hours a week and I have an additional 7 hours of prep, so it's 10 hours of a week to teach my class, and I can still hold an award 40 hours a week and just work a 50-hour week. We don't allow you to do that. So you're not allowed to teach while holding one of these awards full-time. We do, however, allow you to hold the awards part-time. So you could teach and hold an award part-time and do both of those things simultaneously. If you are doing that, though, we don't allow you to carry what would be considered a full-time load on your home campus. So your teaching load would need to be reduced as appropriate on your home campus to say what's considered a half-time load if you're planning to teach half-time and hold the award half-time. And we're happy to answer questions about that on an individual basis, depending on what your particular case is.
Would travel to conferences be included in what that money could go for?
You can use the money to travel during the award period in support of your work. So if you're going to be developing your ideas or talking to people at the conference who are going to be helping further your project, then that would be an allowable use of the money, yes.
Great, Mark, thanks. Oh, I lost track. Okay. Would a prospectus for the book be a good writing sample if no sample chapters are yet completed?
No. You should not submit a prospectus for the book as your writing sample, and that's actually addressed in the notice of funding opportunity. We tell you that you must not submit a prospectus or outline of the book in your writing sample. And the reason for that is that the 3-page narrative statement is that's the space that we allot you to outline the book, to give us an overview of the project. And so if you then spend another 20 pages in your writing sample also giving us a prospectus, that's not following the guidelines. So if you don't have a sample chapter available yet, then you should think about some other piece that you've written in the style that you propose to use for your book, and send us that as the sample instead. And as I said, job one of the writing sample is really to show how you approach the difficulties of writing for a general readership, and how you solve those problems. So the sample should showcase your ability to do that. And it need not be on the very same topic as the book that you're proposing. But if at all possible, I do recommend that you send a sample chapter from the proposed book, because that will make the whole project feel more tangible to the evaluators. It will make them feel that they know what they're going to be getting if they greenlight the project. And it does give you that extra 20 pages to sell your evaluators on the project. But we just ask that you don't do it in the form of a prospectus for the whole book. You need to be diving into to the introduction or to a chapter and showing us how you're going to work those things. You could, by the way, include some excerpts from different parts of your proposed book as your writing sample. So maybe you want to give us 10 pages of the introduction and then 10 pages of one chapter. That's acceptable. And you're welcome to include a note as you're in your writing sample. You're welcome to include a note explaining what you're giving us and how the pieces fit together, how they relate to the whole.
Mark, another attendee asks, can you provide a clearer distinction between creative nonfiction and nonfiction? If I draw on personal experience in my book, is that creative nonfiction?
Merely drawing on personal experience, we would not consider to be creative nonfiction. It can be an effective device for a nonfiction book to frame the topic, to frame the book as a whole on the basis of some personal experience or personal connection that you have, and that's allowable. We don't allow memoir or autobiography, so the book as a whole should not consist purely of your own memories or descriptions of your own experiences. So that would violate a different rule against memoir and autobiography that we have. But as far as creative nonfiction goes, the main thing that we are intending to rule out with that stipulation is imaginative invention. So imagining a scene between the founding fathers or something like that, in which you paint a picture and or provide dialogue that does not have a sound basis in the documentary record. So you need to be able to document what you're telling the reader in terms of what happened. And we don't want you to be inventing things.
Can you provide an example of a proposal that was funded with a background in the allied social sciences, like anthropology?
Not off the top of my head, but that's just because we have a long award list at this point of 180 or so projects. And so two things. If you'd like to follow up on that, send us an email and we'll give you a more definite answer. Or if you'd like to look at examples of recently funded projects, we have not all of them. It's about the most recent 75 or so projects that we funded are listed on the website. But we do have people working in fields of anthropology or sociology that have received funding.
Okay, great.
And one example did just pop into my mind of a book that we funded in the program that was proposed by an anthropologist, and it's Sarah. Oh, now I hope I've got her name right. Sarah Wagner, I believe. And the book is about. It's a study of the operations behind bringing remains of Vietnam War veterans back to the United States, repatriating those remains. And I guess I won't take time to Google it and give you the exact information now, but that's from an anthropologist. It takes an anthropological point of view or a sort of anthropological method of research and writing. And again, feel free to send us an email for more details.
This question, there are a couple of versions of this question. Can you give us a sense of how many applications you receive each year and what the success rate is of applications? And this particular commentator also thanks you for a very helpful session.
We get about 300 applications. That's what we've had in the recent years. And usually about 10% of the applications that we get result in an award, maybe slightly under 10%. But yeah, so roughly 300 applications and about 10% are successful.
I'd like to put two questions together, if you don't mind, Mark. One is about what's desirable in the size of a print run, and the other is about the kinds of references that an applicant might want to include. Are some more helpful than others? Should it be colleagues, employers, academic, non-academic, etc.?
Yeah, both good questions. So on print runs, we don't have hard and fast rules. We don't have an absolute cutoff that is a print run below which we will not go. We have funded projects with print runs as small as, say, 1,500 copies as an initial run, and as large as 75,000, 125,000 copies. It's possible we had a project that was even a bit larger than that in terms of the promised print run. But the typical print run among projects where the person's applying with a contract, and remember that's only about half the successful projects, but it's typically in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 copies that people are promising. And realize that we understand that print runs have to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. For one thing, they are tending to get smaller in the age of digital publication. We understand that. We also know that a publisher may commit to an initial print run with the idea of following up with more copies later. So there are a number of variables that need to be taken into account in assessing print runs. And we're well aware of those factors as we're making these judgments, and print run really is just one among many things that the evaluators would be looking at. I guess if your publisher is thinking that the print run would be on the order of, say, 500 to 800 copies, then that's really getting into the ballpark of what would be expected for an academic monograph. in many cases as well. So that starts to look like a somewhat less promising dissemination plan, and may possibly raise a question with the evaluators. But in general, yeah, 5,000 to 10,000 copies, somewhere in that range is typical, and we certainly have funded projects with a somewhat smaller print runs promised than that.
Great. Another question that's come in. I know this program does not support collaborative works, but how common is it to fund two separate authors with separate proposals working on a common book project?
It's uncommon. We are open to such applications. It is something of an uphill battle, though, often to convince the evaluators that a collaborative project is going to come off. And there's also the price tag to be considered as well. If both authors are asking for full-time funding for 12 months, then we're potentially getting one book for the price of two if we're looking at competing options and proposals from individuals who are proposing to do a book on their own. So it would be worth calling us up to talk about your ideas there. But you might consider, as part of your formulation of the plan, the idea of requesting somewhat less than the full amount of funding. And that's the only case, by the way, where I would recommend that you think about that. That is in the case of a collaboratively proposed project. Otherwise, it does you no good to request less funding for your project. We're not looking for bargains in that sense. So you should request the level of funding that you need. And if it's 12 full months, then request 12 full months, and that won't by itself hurt your chances of getting an award. Your chances will not be less than if you'd only asked for 9 months, say, funding for your project. But getting back to the collaborative proposals, or proposals where two people are submitting to the same competition and saying in their applications that they're going to work together, it's extremely important that you make it clear how you're going to divide the work, who's going to be responsible for what, and how your work depends on each other, because there are just more moving parts in a two-person project. And so evaluators will perhaps have questions about your exact workflow, whether one person could end up delaying the other person's work in some way. So you need to pay very close attention, special attention to your work plan and the way you describe your plan of work if you're going to try to propose a co-authored book with each of you submitting a separate application to the program.
Okay, maybe a couple more we can get in here. What if the book's manuscript is completed or pretty much completed? The funding assistance needed is related to the publication costs, including color printing. May the grant be applied in such cases? Considering that the author may not put 40 hours per week since the manuscript is completed or near completion.
Yes, that would be likely a not very competitive application, or possibly there wouldn't even be a way to put it together so that it would be eligible as proposed, because we require a minimum commitment of 6 full-time months or the equivalent. So if you're not able to productively occupy yourself for 6 full-time months or the equivalent, then you won't have a convincing plan of work, and that is one of the criteria of evaluation. So you wouldn't, in other words, be able to say, I need $30,000 for publication costs, but I'm actually just going to be working on the book for 1 month or something like that. So we do expect you to be working on the book, and that's really the main purpose of these grants, is to support the intellectual labor and the research that's needed to bring a project to fruition, as opposed to publication costs. Now, it would be acceptable to use some of the money to pay for publication costs if you are able to propose a work plan that meets our minimum requirements. So let's say you do have 6 months of full-time work to do, then you can request that amount. And if you're successful, you could get a grant of $30,000, and then you could allocate some of that money towards publication costs. That would be okay. It's at your discretion at that point how you use the money you've been awarded in support of the project. But we would still insist that you do those 6 full-time months of work and have that much work to do on the book as a condition for holding the grant.
Mark, Anonymous asks, how do you document allowable uses of the funds provided?
We ask you to submit a final report at the end of the grant period explaining how you have used your time and telling us whether you encountered any problems or had to change your plan. And when you accept a grant, you agree to a set of terms and conditions, which are published on our website. You can Google NEH Public Scholars Terms and Conditions, and you'll find the document that sets forth the conditions of holding the grant. And if you're not able to fulfill the terms of the grant, then we expect you to be in touch with us about figuring out how to handle the situation. And in the worst case scenario, we would ask you to return some or all of the money. But you are bound by the terms and conditions that we set forth at the time that you accept an award.
Thanks. Let's see, we're getting close to time. We can take, I guess, one more question. Could you elaborate on the issue? Could you elaborate on the issue of a book that might focus on the social sciences using humanistic methods? I think this is not the question I meant to choose.
You know what, Beauty, I just realized that I did not speak to the second part of the 2-part question that you put to me before, so maybe I'll do that. It was a question about references and who are the best types of references.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
To ask to write letters, and that's a good question of broad interest. So let me try and address that. You should think first about asking people who know your project well and who can write with some authority about why it's important. And that's much more significant. Getting that kind of letter will be much more significant than having a big name write your letter for you. So you want someone who's going to take the time to read your proposal and think about it, and then to write a letter that addresses the significance and appeal of the project that you've proposed at some length. So a nice paragraph about why what you're doing matters and why it will appeal to a general audience. You might think about, in terms of who to ask, you might think about sort of balancing your own identity a bit with the identities of your letter writers. So what I mean by that is, if you're a full-time academic, you might think about asking for a letter from someone who's not a full-time academic. If you know such a person who would be in a position to write a letter for you, say a full-time biographer who's not in part of the academic world. And then conversely, if you're not an academic yourself, you might think about asking an academic to write on your behalf, because often scholars can bring a valuable perspective on a project. And particularly in terms of making the case for its intellectual significance, they often are in a position to frame the project in a way that convinces evaluators about its significance, and may choose a slightly different framing than what you've chosen to use in yourself in your own narrative statement. I think it's 3:01 now, so we'll draw things to a close here. Thank you all for your attention and for your interest in the program. I hope you found this presentation helpful. And as I said at the outset, if we were not able to get to your question, please feel free to email us or call us, and we'll do our best to get you some answers. Thanks again, and we'll say goodbye.